Thanks everyone for being here and tolerating my disorganization. I am Michael Clemens of the Center for Global Development. This is our external research seminar where we're just delighted to bring in some of the best researchers in the world. Today is a prime example of that. It's a privilege to have Professor Caroline Theoharides here and David McKenzie. Caroline is at the economics department at Amherst College. There's no young economist who does better work on migration and development. I learned from her work constantly, cited constantly. Something that really distinguishes it is not just her analytical brilliance, but her willingness to do the long-term deep networking with government agencies that yields administrative data, the kind that usually sits around and that economists like her can really unlock information from. And just delighted to see a brand new work of hers today. I saw a draft working paper dated September 8th. So this is really very, very fresh research, and just delighted to see that. It's especially a privilege to see David McKenzie here. I could spend half an hour on superlatives about David, but to make a long story short, there's no economist in the world that we've learned more from about migration and development. And the painful thing is, for me, is that that's just one of the things that David does, one of his specialties. And the reaction I have on reading any paper from David in this area, the first reaction is something, is the bitter reaction of wishing he'd leave something for the rest of us to study. So I can't imagine a better person to give comments on Caroline's work. We have an hour, maybe go over a few minutes due to me, and Caroline maybe something like 40 or even 35 minutes, followed by 10 minutes of David, and then some open discussion. Does that sound okay?
Sure, that sounds great. Thank you.
Terrific. Then please go ahead. Thanks for coming.
Great. Okay, can you see that okay? There we go. You guys can see it okay?
Yes.
Fabulous. Awesome. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for having me, and thanks for such a flattering welcome, Michael. It's really an honor to be here. And I think a big part of the motivation for Susie and I to finally get this draft done was that we knew we could get such great feedback from David and from all of you. So we're really this is early stage work, and we're really looking forward to any thoughts or suggestions that you have on this. So what we're going to be talking about today is behavioral responses to temporary migration, and in particular, thinking about examining origin country fertility behavior. Okay, so temporary migrants often keep close ties with their communities of origin, and this is even more true for temporary migrants than for migrants that are migrating permanently. And so while these migrants are abroad, they often spend time in a culture that's quite different from the origin community that they may be leaving from. When they return at the end of their migration episode, the exposure that they have to different cultural practices may come back with them and may influence the behavior and preferences in their communities of origin. And so there's been some nice recent work that's shown how exposure to destination country policies and attitudes through migration can affect voting patterns and political behavior, as well as gender norms. And so what we're going to be thinking about today is how exposure to destination country attitudes and behavior surrounding reproductive health policy may influence fertility decisions in the country of origin. Oftentimes, fertility decisions may vary substantially between destination and origin countries, and so this gives an opportunity for those behaviors to transmit across these countries. Fertility decisions have really important consequences for development, both at a micro and macro level. And so thinking about how this transmission of fertility behavior works is another way in which migration can impact development in origin countries. So there's been more broadly a large literature on the effects of migration on fertility throughout demography, sociology, and economics. And so there's a lot of evidence about theories surrounding adaptation and assimilation behavior. And by and large, these studies have found that migrants adapt or assimilate to the fertility patterns in the destination country that they're visiting. So there's another literature that's moving sort of beyond this adaptation and assimilation at destination to thinking about how this information may diffuse back to the country of origin. Okay, so migrants may share their experiences, they may bring back knowledge, and this will diffuse through their communities in their origin country. There's some nice evidence that migrants often maintain modified fertility behavior upon return. This is typically comparing migrant households to non-migrant households. Ben and some co-authors also have a nice macroeconomic study where they look at how this can affect fertility in the country overall. If you think about the mechanisms through which this could happen, there are a number of potential mechanisms. So the first that we're going to think about here is income. So increased income could lead to increased ability to adopt contraceptives, which could then subsequently lead to reductions in fertility. Another potential channel is through information. So migrants learn about contraceptive behaviors at destination. They bring that information back with them. And so David and Nicole Hildebrand show this in terms of contraceptive knowledge, about knowledge of contraceptives for migrants from Mexico. And then there's some nice work in Guatemala by Lindstrom and Munoz Franco showing similar things about knowledge of contraceptives in Guatemala. Finally, another potential channel that this could happen through is through a preferences channel. Okay, so rather than learning new information, these migrants may actually change their preferences and behaviors about fertility. So they may change their desired level of fertility, or they may have different feelings about their unmet need for contraceptives. And so in the macro study that I mentioned before, they develop a theoretical model where they look at these different channels and through empirical estimation argue that it's coming through preferences. Okay, so what we're going to do in this paper is we're going to answer the causal question, what's the effect of exposure to destination country reproductive health policies through temporary migration on fertility decisions in the country of origin? Okay, and specifically, the way we're going to do this is we're going to examine the effect of exposure to more open, or what we're going to call liberalized, reproductive health policies on fertility and contraceptive decisions in the Philippines. When we say liberalized, what we mean by this, I'm going to use the term liberalized throughout, but what we're thinking about when we say liberalized is just reproductive health policy that has fewer legal restrictions. Okay, so we're thinking about fewer legal restrictions toward adoption of using the contraceptive pill, something like that. I'll go through them more carefully in a couple of minutes. So to identify this, what we'll do is we'll exploit spatial and temporal variation in policies across destination countries for Filipino migrants. So specifically what we're going to do is we're going to create destination-specific policy indices. We're going to weight these by the destination mix in Philippine municipalities to create a measure of exposure. Okay, we'll then interact that with the historical density of migrants, so the baseline migration rate, and we'll identify any effects that we find off changes in policies in destination countries holding constant the baseline rate of migration. Okay, so we're thinking about identifying effects off changes in policies surrounding the contraceptive pill in Saudi Arabia holding constant how much migration a given municipality is sending. Because we identify off these changes within a municipality over time, this is going to eliminate the types of threats that you might be worried about, that certain municipalities are going to send migrants to they're going to facilitate migration of migrants to more sort of progressive destination countries, okay? And so what we find is we find declines in fertility and increased use of modern contraceptives. We have some suggestive evidence that the mechanism appears to be coming through changes in preferences, and we test as well the channels for income and information. So in terms of contributions, what we do here is we examine the effective impacts of policy changes abroad rather than thinking about overall exposure to migration. Okay, that identifying variation is going to be coming through changes in these policies. And this identification strategy is going to eliminate threats that certain municipalities facilitate migration to more progressive destinations. We'll also attempt to disentangle income, information, and preferences as mechanisms through which these effects happen. Okay, so let me just give you a little bit of background on temporary migration in the Philippines. So the Philippines is one of many countries that facilitates temporary migration as a key development strategy. And this is true for other countries like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and the Philippines is one such country that does this. Approximately 2% of their population migrates each year. The modality of contracts is about 24 months. Okay, migrants may stay abroad for much longer, but they'll typically renew those contracts at the end of 24 months. They often return for a period of time, typically for Christmas, in between those contracts, though they may stay abroad for much longer. The top destination countries for Filipinos, for temporary Filipino migrants are largely in the Middle East and throughout Asia, but they also include the US, Canada, and countries in the EU. They also work in a wide range of occupations. So they work in high-skilled occupations such as nurses and engineers, and they work in lower-skilled occupations such as domestic helpers, laborers, construction workers, things along those lines. The networks that they establish are an important determinant of where they go, and we see really important patterns of networks from certain municipalities or provinces to different destination countries over time. In terms of reproductive health, the Philippines has experienced slower declines in fertility than the rest of Southeast Asia. Contraceptive adoption has increased over our sample period. So it went from about 47% in 1998 to 55% in 2013. Yet there's still really high reported rates of unwanted pregnancies and unmet need for contraceptives. Contraceptive use is still heavily influenced by the Catholic Church. The Philippines is an overwhelmingly Catholic country, and much of the discourse around reproductive health and contraceptive use is influenced heavily by the Church. There have also been shifts toward modern methods, with sterilization being the most common in the early part of our sample, shifting toward the pill as a more common method in recent years. Okay, so in terms of the data that we're going to use, in terms of our outcome variables about fertility and contraception, we're going to use 4 waves of the Philippine DHS. This is a comprehensive survey of women aged 15 to 49. And so what we do with this is we use retrospective birth history data to construct a birth year panel for women over our sample period. Okay, what we're going to do specifically is we're going to look at the time from the age of menarche until the present period going back 18 years. Okay, so for a particular woman, if she's 45, we'll look 18 years in the past at her birth history. If a woman was, say, 18 at the time of the DHS survey in 2013, we'll only go back as far as the age of menarche, okay, to take into account when she would have actually been able to give birth. Okay, so we'll construct this birth year panel. And we'll also construct contraceptive use outcomes using 5-year retrospective histories of current contraceptives. These are only available in 1998 and 2003. So we're able to create a 10-year panel of contraceptive use for women in the Philippines over this period of time. In terms of migration data, we're going to use data from the Philippine Overseas Employment Administration and the Overseas Worker Welfare Administration, which includes information on all migrants that have left the Philippines since 1992. We've updated the data from some previous work that I have so that it goes through 2016. And so we're able to establish these flows of migrants from their origin municipality to the destination. Okay, and so we're able to measure this municipality level exposure of temporary contract migrants across the Philippines. We're going to use the baseline data in the first year in 1992 to measure both the intensity of migration, which we define as the total number of migrants divided by the population, as well as the destination mix of these migrants. When I say destination mix, I mean the share of migrants going to each destination out of the total number of temporary migrants. Okay, so a particular province might send 50% of their, or a particular municipality might send 50% of their migrants to Saudi Arabia. They might facilitate migration of 25% to the UK, and then another 25% go to Malaysia. So that's the destination mix that we're thinking about here. We then use geographic identifiers within the DHS in order to link the Philippine migration data at the municipality level. So I think the main other source of variation that we'll be using here is a database on reproductive health policy. So what we're going to do here is we've adapted a data set compiled by Finley, Canning, and Poe, where they've created country decade-specific indices on reproductive health. Okay, so what they've done is they've collected information on the laws in 186 countries at the decade level, from the 1970s through the present, or through 2010, I think is what they've compiled them for. And so they split these into 5 categories. So they have abortion laws, condom, pill, IUD, and sterilization laws, and they create separate indices for each of these different methods. Okay, so for each index, there's a scoring method that they're going to use that determines the level of quote unquote liberalization. And we mean less legal restrictions, again, when we say liberalization. So let me show you an example of the pill scoring mechanism. Okay, so the scoring mechanism, there are a variety of different things they're scored on. They're scored on the sale purpose, the sale location, whether or not a prescription is required, if a subsidy is in place, and commercial advertising. Okay, and so as you can see, They get 0 points if it's illegal for each of these categories. They get 1 point, for instance, for sale purposes if it's sold for non-contraceptive purposes. And then if the pill is sold for contraceptive purposes, they get 2 points. Similarly, for commercial advertising, this bottom row, they get 1 point if it's legal in reproductive health education programs or for doctors. They get 2 points if it's legal with some restrictions. They get 3 points if it's legal without restrictions. This is all of their coding mechanism. So the maximum points for liberalization for the pill is 12 points. So it's the 3 points here, 3 points here, and then 2 points for the sale purpose, sale location, and prescription requirement. We define our sub-index as the number of points a country receives divided by the total possible number of points. So if you think about a country going from commercial advertising being illegal to it being legal without restrictions, this would be a 3-point increase in their sub-index. Okay, so what we do is to create a composite index, we're going to standardize each of these sub-industries and average across the 5. We're going to give them equal weight in what I'm going to show you today. Okay. The Finley data is decade specific, but we want to have variation at the specific year level. So we've gone back to their sources. We've worked with a big team of RAs and gone back to their sources to determine the exact year of the policy change in order to create a country-specific data set for these indices. What we then do is we link these country-specific indices to the migrant flow database at the country year level. Okay, so for each destination for Filipinos, we're able to link this index so that we can see the liberalization policies there. Okay, so let me show you some variation in this. So these are changes at the country level. Okay, so what you can see is that in terms of all policy types, 66% of countries had some change in their in one of these types of policies. Overwhelmingly, the changes are coming through, or not overwhelmingly, but the biggest changes are coming through the pill. 41% of countries had a change in pill laws, and 33% of countries had a change in laws surrounding condoms. Okay, in terms of the liberalization index overall, what you can see here is that this is as a percent of the maximum amount of liberalization. So sterilization is by far the most liberalized, okay, with a score of 83.92. Abortion as a percent of max liberalization is the least liberalized with a score of 57.88. Things have become more liberalized over time across all of these, okay? So if we look in the base year at the percent of max liberalization relative to the final year of our sample in 2013, you can see that these have become increasingly liberalized over time. One more look at this. I want to show you the distribution of the index. Okay, so this is the distribution of non-zero changes in liberalization from 1990 to 2014. Okay, you can see here that there are both positive and negative changes. This isn't all countries liberalizing over time. Some countries are sort of adopting more legal restrictions as we march forward in time. But you can see that overall the distribution is shifted to the right, suggesting that overall we're moving toward more liberalized policies. Okay, so in terms of the empirical strategy, the 2 key sources of variation that we're going to exploit here are temporal variation in destination country reproductive health policy, as well as spatial variation, both in the intensity of how much migration a given municipality has, as well as the destination mix of the migrants and where they're going from that municipality in terms of temporary migration. Okay, so our estimating equation is as follows, where YMT is a binary variable equal to 1 if woman I gave birth in municipality M in year T, or if reported using contraceptives in that period. Okay, we regress this on migrate MT equals 0, which is the base migration rate in 1992 in the municipality, as well as the liberalization index. So this is a standardized liberalization index in the municipality. Okay, so how do we create this for the municipality? Well, what we did was we used the base share of migrant flows from the municipality to the destination country to weight the index for each destination country. We then aggregate these destination specific measures at the municipality year level. Okay, so using the example I said before, if a municipality has 50% of migrants going to Saudi Arabia's liberalization index will compose 50% of the total index for that municipality. Okay, then our key variable of interest is the interaction of those two. So our coefficient of interest is beta 3. We also include province fixed effects. Those are delta P. So this will take care of any time invariant province specific characteristics. We have time fixed effects to control for any countrywide specific factors that have occurred. And then we're also going to include province specific linear time trends. We want to make sure that we allow for fertility to trend differentially across these different provinces. So we're going to control for that as well. Finally, one remaining threat that you might be thinking about is omitted variables that are correlated with both fertility and the interaction term. Okay, so my migration rate times this liberalization index. Now, we've already controlled for the baseline migration rate, and we've already controlled for the baseline liberalization index, but we're concerned about municipalities that might have the same initial rate of migration and experience the same level of the liberalization index. And so if they have a different destination mix, we could be picking up differences in terms of who has that baseline destination mix rather than the policy changes themselves. Okay, so we want to control for that destination mix at baseline in order to account for that. I should also mention that we're lagging the liberalization index by 2 periods. This is because of those 24-month contracts that I mentioned before. So we want to think about the things that migrants are exposed to abroad affecting their origin municipalities 2 years later. Okay, so the migrants go abroad, they're there for 2 years, then they come back home again. So that's why we have that lag for 2 periods. We show robustness to that, and I can show you that later if you're interested in that. Okay, so in terms of the identifying assumption, in the absence of the policy change, fertility in municipalities with higher baseline migration would not have evolved differentially to provinces with lower baseline migration. In terms of threats to validity, conditional on the same level of migration, remember we're controlling for the baseline level of migration, municipalities may have migrants and destinations with more liberal health policies, and those may differ from those that do not. Okay, so we're going to control for that baseline destination mix. I'm also going to show you a check for pre-trends as well when we get to the analysis in a couple of minutes. Another potential threat you might be worried about is domestic or destination specific policies that change simultaneously with these changes in our index. Okay. One thing that I think is useful about our identification strategy is because we're identifying off these changes, it's not about the absence of individuals who are abroad. Okay, so we're holding the baseline rate of migration fixed. And so we're not thinking about that, one municipality has half their population abroad and the other doesn't. And so that's what's leading to declines in fertility. Okay, so in terms of identifying variation, let me just show you a little bit more here. So this is at the municipality level. You can see in the top row here that all municipalities experience some change in terms of the liberalization index. They experience some policy change during this period. Okay, the average number of instances was about 4.5 policy changes that they experienced, and the average weighted change is about a 7.5 percentage point change. Okay, and this shifted toward more liberal policies over the course of our sample. Let me show you the variation in policy changes for key destinations. Okay, so this is over our sample period, which is 1990 through 2013. Okay, and so what you can see here in terms of the number of policy changes, this is for the top 10 destinations at baseline from the Philippines. There were no changes in abortion. So this is not coming through changes in abortion policy. There were, however, changes in contraceptive policy. Saudi Arabia experienced 3 such changes in terms of contraceptive policy. Japan had 1. This was loosening restrictions on the pill. So the pill became legal during this time period. I should mention that Hong Kong, we assign the policies of China. We will also show robustness checks to dropping Hong Kong from the sample as well. Northern Mariana Islands, for instance, would be assigned the policies of the US. So the territories or disputed regions we've assigned in that way, but we will show robustness to drop in that as well. Okay, so one more example of identifying variation. So in Japan, in 1999, as I mentioned, they approved the use of the pill for contraceptive purposes. Let's take 2 municipalities, both within Metro Manila. So they're right by each other in Metro Manila. We have Makati and Taguig. So they have similar baseline migrant shares, 1.46% of the population in Makati and 1.47 in Taguig. But the share of temporary migrants to Japan is 25% from Makati and 6% from Taguig. So this policy will have this liberalization will have much more of an impact on Japan than on Taguig. Okay, skip that. Okay, so in terms of effects on fertility, what we're going to do here, so the first outcome that we're going to look at is just the effect on whether or not a woman gave birth. Okay, so equal to 1 if the woman gave birth in that period. Okay, so this is column 1. So consider the effect of a 0.1 standard deviation increase in liberalization. And I want you to consider this for the average baseline migration rate, which is 0.2% of the municipality population. Okay, if this is the case, we find a decline in fertility of 0.04 percentage points, which is about a 0.25% decline in fertility as a result of exposure to these policies. We show in the paper that there's no evidence of pre-trends. We examine this from 1980 through 1992. Okay, so this is before the sample period that we're looking at. And we find a coefficient in that period of negative 0.03 percentage points versus the negative 1.82 that we find here in terms of our main specification. It's also not statistically significant. Okay, so it does appear that exposure to more liberalized reproductive health policies are leading to significant and meaningful declines in terms of fertility behavior. Now, the next thing that we do is we want to examine if there's heterogeneity, and important heterogeneity, in terms of whether males or females are the ones that migrate. So what we've done is we've recreated our liberalization index just based on this subgroup. Okay, so just based on the destination mix of females leaving from a particular municipality or of males leaving from a particular municipality. So we might think that there could be different effects of females versus males being exposed to these liberalized policies. Perhaps women are empowered to make different choices, and they're able to do this sort of in secret now as a result of this knowledge, and so they can make their own contraceptive decisions without having to talk to men about it, as they might have to for traditional contraceptive methods. We might also find equal effects. Perhaps men and women both transfer this knowledge back to their origin communities. Okay, what we find, in fact, is we find much sex for men than for women, which perhaps ex ante is not surprising, but I do think it's worth noting that we find anything for men at all. So there does seem to be this transfer of men being exposed to these more liberalized policies coming back to their origin communities. Okay, we do a similar analysis thinking about occupations. So one of the main occupations for Filipino migrants is as domestic helpers, and these migrants typically live in the household of the family that they're working for. Okay, this is juxtaposed with non-domestic helpers who often live in dorms or live in localized communities with other Filipinos. And so one thing that we were curious about is how does that difference in exposure matter? Okay, if you're in a home where you're maybe exposed to more local customs and local TV, does that change relative to if you're, say, in a dormitory where you might hear about an advertisement for condoms and you're talking about it with your friends in the dormitory? Okay, so we look at this, we look at the domestic helper variation in column 4. We add caregivers who have a similar situation, though typically are slightly higher skilled in column 5. And then because domestic helpers are about 96% female, we look at non-domestic helpers just for females. We find really similar results across the two categories. We cannot reject the null hypothesis that they're the same. Okay. So moving on to contraceptive use. How am I doing for time, Michael? Like about 5 minutes?
That would be great if you can.
Okay. I think that'll be good. Yeah, thank you. So in terms of contraceptive use, what we find is we find evidence of switching from traditional to modern contraceptive methods. Okay, so you can see a decline in the use of contraceptive methods and an increase, though not statistically significant, in modern methods. The effects on each of these individual methods are not significant, but it seems like much of this is coming through the pill and through IUDs, which are methods that have been adopted in the Philippines previously, rather than, say, injectables, which have really low rates of take up in the Philippines overall. Okay, so in terms of mechanisms, okay, so let's turn to this mechanism of income. So I mentioned before that one possible channel for our results is changes in income, okay? So what this would mean is that countries, we'd be concerned about this both in terms of a mechanism, but also potentially as an omitted variable, if countries with more liberalized reproductive health policy also are liberalizing more generally, and maybe are paying higher wages to workers or something like that, okay? So what we want to do is our data set includes wage data, okay? So we control for the median migrant income in each municipality year. Now, we don't know the municipality of origin in about 5 years of our sample period. So what I've done in panel A is I've replicated our main results with just this smaller sample. And then in panel B, I've added those controls. And you can see that the results are robust to adding that wage control, suggesting both that we're not concerned about income as an omitted variable driving the results. It also does not seem like income is a particularly important channel in terms of how these policy changes are working and the mechanism of diffusion. Okay, next we think about information. Okay, so to look at this, we use questions in the DHS about if individuals have ever heard of these methods. Okay, and we really don't find anything here. Okay, so in terms of if they've ever heard of modern methods or traditional methods or any contraceptive methods or the specific types, we don't really find any evidence of that here. The final thing we look at is in terms of preferences. Okay, so using the outcomes from the DHS, I think the best measures we had about how people are thinking about their preferred fertility is thinking about what they report as their desired number of children. And then we also look at questions for unmet need for spacing and limiting. Okay, so we find some evidence of changes in preferences through the desired fertility, the desired number of children. In particular, we find that a 0.1 standard deviation increase in the liberalization index in the average municipality leads to a 0.05 decline in the desired number of children. Okay, we show a bunch of different robustness checks. I'm happy to talk about lots of these. You know, in the question and answer, we try excluding Metro Manila. We exclude the territories or disputed regions that I mentioned, since the policy assignment is perhaps not exactly accurate. We also look at different ways to code the policies. We change our lag structure, and we do a falsification check with leads. We also examine the results if we look at municipalities that have greater than 50 women per year, because the DHS is not nationally representative. And we show similar results if we have the top 20 destinations only, rather than all potential destination countries for Filipinos. Okay, so in conclusion, exposure to more liberalized reproductive health policies at destination results in fertility declines in origin communities. And this appears to be achieved through switching from traditional methods to modern contraceptive methods. We have some suggestive evidence that it appears to be due to changes in preferences rather than changes in income or information. And I think sort of the broad conclusion that I'd like you to take away is that what we've done here is we've provided further evidence that migration can lead to the transmission of destination country behavior to the origin country broadly. But in as much as fertility impacts long-run development, our results are suggesting another way in which migration may have impacts on origin country development. So I'll stop there, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. Let's go right to David before getting to others.
Let me stop there you go. Perfect.
Fantastic. So, you know, thanks very much, Caroline. This was really fascinating to read. And so, you know, when Caroline first sent the paper, she, you know, said, you know, look, this is, you know, we're looking at something that's a, you know, relatively underexplored topic. And I said, well, you know, this is something that economists may not have, you know, been looking at for a while, but it's something that's, you know, really been there for quite a while in the sociology literature, the demography literature. So, you know, here's Google Scholar, migration and fertility norms, 176,000 results. You know, this is something where, you know, people have been thinking about this for a while. And so it's really nice to see this contribution, which I think, you know, does you know, takes a step forward in this literature. And so, you know, the way I would, you know, think about sort of classifying, you know, these studies is, you know, the first set of studies, and this is, you know, part of what I was working on early on, was really just saying, you know, let's compare migrants to non-migrants, or places with lots of migration to places with less migration, going to one destination. And then what we get is kind of the overall impact of migration on fertility. And so this could be Mexicans going to the US or Egyptians going to the Gulf. And it's, you know, we've got to deal with all the selection issues. But then even once we do that, it's really hard to understand, you know, what the bundle is going on here. You know, they're migrating, they're going to one particular place. And so it's really hard to get at this cultural transmission or norms. And so then, you know, the second set of studies said, well, let's look at migrants who are going to different places. And so, you know, there's some early work by Philippe Fargue on this, which says, you know, let's look at Morocco and Turkey, where people go to the West, and compare them to Egypt, where people go to the Gulf. And, you know, they're sort of migrating to places with different fertility norms, and maybe, you know, we'll see differences there. Or there's this cross-country work that Caroline talked about. And, you know, that's sort of starting to get at this idea that, you know, it matters not just whether you migrate, but where you migrate and what the norms are in those places. But it's still, you know, there's a whole bundle of attributes associated with those different places. It's not just fertility norms that are different when you go to Saudi Arabia versus whether you go to the US. And so, you know, this is making progress, but it's still not getting the whole way there. And so I think what's, you know, really interesting about the approach that she's doing in this paper is saying, you know, let's not just look at where migrants are going, but where they're going at a time where things are changing in those places. And so, you know, we're really trying to nail, you know, what is going on with respect to contraceptive policy in the particular places where migrants are going to. And so it's sort of, I think a third generation of these types of studies, and I think it's sort of the first that I've seen that has, tried to kind of add these additional layers of changes. And so I think that's really, really interesting. And so, my comments, I guess, will be, okay, this is fantastic, but then it's quite hard to see, where the variation is coming from. So, so as she put out, there's this equation here, we're really interested in this interaction between, the migration rate and, what the policies are in the place that you go to. And so, I think the first question I have, and she's taken some steps towards that already in those robustness checks, is to say, while we had a whole lot of municipalities, she said there's, I think, I thought there was 1,400. It seems like she said 1,600 or something. There's a bunch of municipalities in the Philippines. There's a bunch of destination countries that they go to. So there's all these, but in the end, the migration is actually pretty concentrated in a few countries. So the top 10 destinations account for 86% of the action. And so, if I'm thinking about what's really going on or what could realistically be affecting fertility patterns, it doesn't even matter what Spain's doing. Spain's destination number 19 here, there's only 700 people from the whole of the Philippines going to Spain each year. Who cares what Spain does? Even if every single one of those people change their fertility behavior and influence 5 others to change theirs, we're not going to see that in the data. And so, really what's going on is all these people going to these sort of top 10 destinations or so. And so, what matters is what's changing in those places. And so she talked about, well, we have a set of destinations like Saudi Arabia and Japan where the policies changed, not the countries we would typically put together in thinking about, this is where changes versus levels matter a lot, I think, in terms of attitudes. And so, it's not clear to me that the change in making contraceptive a little bit easier to access in Saudi Arabia from a really low level of access, perhaps, versus in a country where it's at a very high level is going to be the same. But still, intuitively, we're thinking about, this out of these 10 countries or so, about half of them changed their policies, half of them didn't. It'd be nice to sort of really say, okay, what we're really looking at is, there's these parts of the Philippines where people went to Saudi Arabia and Japan, these other parts where people went to Hong Kong and Singapore, and that's where, that's what's driving our difference. So that's the sort of first part of that. The second part of this is sort of something that's come up a lot in this sort of new literature on these sort of Bartek instruments or shift shear instruments, which is just saying, these shocks are not independent across municipalities. There's not, in this regression here where she had 1,500 municipalities or however many, it's not that there's 1,500 new independent shocks going on, which is what's sort of going on in the current estimation where things are getting clustered at the municipality level. But, realistically, if it's only these top 10 countries that are changing things, there's really only 10 shocks going on. And so, we need to think about what's the randomized experiment that's in the back of our mind here. The randomized experiment is, I shock Saudi Arabia and Japan versus shocking Singapore and South Korea and things. And so, that matters for thinking about how much variation there is in this policy. And it's even, a little bit more than that here because of this time variation. And so it's, the question is, do we want to think about this as Saudi Arabia shocks things in 1999 versus in 1992, or is that where our variation's coming from, or is it coming from, Saudi Arabia versus Japan? But again, I think it's just, really trying to make clear to the reader, where is this change coming from? Because all this, this is the big contribution is these changes. So, related to that, I think the sort of second part of this, and I should say this is all, a literature that we're all having to deal with because all these nice and comfy tools that we had for a while are all getting questioned, and each week there's a new paper that comes out and says, put away your toys, here's another problem with them. But, I think in thinking about these sort of shift share type instruments or approaches, one of the critiques in the migration literature is that it takes time for adjustment to take place and that dynamics can be quite key. And so, there's this nice paper by David Yeager and others about this in the migration context, which sort of says, you're not just adjusting to the shock today, you're also still seeing adjustments from previous shocks. And so, that's what I wonder about here with these changes in this index. They do this Fourier composition, Caroline and Susie, and say, a lot of these changes are actually quite stable and persistent, which is what we'd expect, right? It's not that each year Japan's deciding, let's randomize what our abortion laws should be this year or our contraceptive laws this year. They sort of change and then it sort of stays the same. And so, these norms are also taking time to transmit and evolve kind of slowly. And so what we should see is, my behavior in time t should not just be affected by what the shock is in time t-2, but also by what happens in t-1 and t-3 and t-5. And, if I leave out those lags, there's sort of a bunch of omitted variables in this regression. And so, Caroline says, well, we looked at robustness to putting in t-4 or t-3, but it's not that we should only be putting in one. All of those things should be in there, affecting it in some sense, or else, we just want to aggregate up to a higher frequency than annual frequency, because I'm not sure there's really enough independent variation at that annual level. Maybe we want to think about 5-year changes or something, because norms take some time to change. And I think, related to that is it's not that these policy changes are sort of exogenously introduced necessarily in a lot of destinations. They could reflect how society's been evolving already, right? It's not that Texas suddenly woke up overnight and became Texas. It's been Texas for a long time, and now Texas is just suddenly enacting its Texasness on the rest of the population there. But you knew what you were doing when you went to Texas a long time ago. So I think it's that same thing going on here, that we see politicians reflecting their population with their laws, and so the exact year that the law changes may not reflect sort of what the norms are and what things are changing. So this is again an argument for thinking about dynamics and for maybe aggregating to a sort of higher 5-year or sort of a little bit longer and thinking about some of these lags. This and then the sort of other point on dynamics. Again, this is where other people are coming along and saying, more problems with our sort of methods is this whole sort of new difference in difference literature is saying, if there are these dynamic effects and they're coming in at different points in time, we've got to be really careful about who we're comparing, which units are getting compared as sort of switched on and switched off. And so, in some sense, if you've got Japan coming in 1999 and then Saudi Arabia coming in 2001, and I'm getting variation from the changes, then I might be sort of not just comparing places which are liberalized to not liberalized, but places which liberalized earlier to places which liberalized later. And then it's again not quite clear, when I take an average of all those effects, what's happening there, and I could potentially end up with sort of some weird sign if things are dynamic. And so I think this is again where if you can really think where that identification is coming from and graphically, show us in some sort of event study or difference in difference type graph and make clear, here's where we see this change. I think it's going to be more convincing. So that's sort of all methodology. My final, set of points on this last slide is just about, thinking about mechanisms. And so, I think this is really useful that Caroline's going into this, and I think the stuff on desired fertility is quite strong. That's a nice result there. I guess ruling out other channels I think is harder, and so it's hard for me to sort of say, well, you're completely ruling out knowledge, because the question just says, have you heard of a contraceptive method? And so 92% have heard of the pill to start with, so there's not much scope for hearing about the pill to change. But we know, of course, that there's a lot of concerns people have about the technology of it, about side effects, about how long it takes to get pregnant coming off it, whether it protects against different STIs and things. And so we saw just in the last week or so, Rachel Glenister had a nice Vox Dev piece on a radio campaign on contraceptives in Burkina Faso, and one of the big things that came through there was really the radio campaign it wasn't teaching people there is a thing like the pill. It was here's all these concerns you might have about it, and it's helping you understand that knowledge. And so I think we need to sort of don't be so quick to rule out knowledge as a channel. The other thing on mechanisms I wanted to just note briefly is, potentially there's this, again, with the dynamics, there's this other channel through, affecting your option to migrate and your potential future migration behaviors, which is, if I know now that it's going to be easier to get my pill when I go to, Saudi Arabia, or when I go there, then now maybe I might be more likely to want to go there, but I know I can't go there if I'm pregnant, so I might change my fertility behavior now because of the option to migrate in the future. And so this could be another channel, just like we have that sort of option channel affecting our education decisions. And then the final last point on mechanisms was sort of, if this is really changing desired norms and things, we should expect it's going to affect changes more for some people than others. And so some of the literature, for example, on the Mexican migration has looked at what happens to groups like teenagers or women who have already reached the desired fertility level. We should expect them to be much more sensitive to changes in contraceptive access than people who are either not planning on have already finished their fertility, or who are going to have 2 or 3 kids, and this is not going to affect them. And so I'm not sure the scope for looking at particular groups in the data you have from the DHS, but changes at different age groups, but that might be interesting to explore. But again, I think this is really making a step forward in these generations of studies, and I think it's just trying to make clearer to us where that variation is coming from. But really nice job, Caroline. Thanks.
Wow, thank you so much, David. Caroline, you got the QJE review in advance for free, and just greatly appreciated. We have 10 minutes left, maybe a few more. Caroline, if you want to say anything, please go ahead, or we could just have more discussion.
No, I'll just echo what you said. Thank you, David. Those were so thorough and will be so helpful in revising this for sure. So I've taken several pages of notes, so I'm really grateful. Thanks a lot.
I do want to say in the working paper I just saw today, there is a footnote that says, yeah, we know about Borosiak et al. And Callaway and Santana, and we're going to do that. So that's on the way. Maybe I don't see a hand up, and please, we're a small group, so please jump in or put your hand up. But in the meantime, I just wanted to say, I wanted to jump on my hobby horse, which some people on this call will sort of roll their eyes because they've heard me say this before, but there's this relatively neglected paper by Özerbalde and Sorensen in Empirical Economics, where they argue that every time we are interested in estimating the coefficient on an interaction term in the presence of fixed effects, it is absolutely necessary to demean both variables before interacting them, and give a bunch of examples of where the problems arise. Intuitively, it's because it's an extension of the reason why you have to put the uninteracted terms in the regression. If they happen to have a skewed distribution so that the interaction of them creates something very highly nonlinear, then the uninteracted nonlinear components end up in the error term and can, by that mechanism, bias the coefficient on the interaction term. And then they proceed to trash several top journal articles, recreating them and showing them that their interaction terms are change sign when corrected. And it reminds me a lot of the recent diffs and diffs literature, but several years beforehand, and should strike fear into everybody's hearts. It's something you want to make absolutely sure the results are robust to. If the distributions of the uninteracted variables are not that strange, then you won't find the coefficient changing. But if there's a lot of non-normality in the distribution, you could find it changing quite a lot. And you've already done so many robustness checks, but that one I'd really highlight as a critical one. And the rest of David's comments left me nothing to say, because they were just very, very comprehensive. Any others have a reaction? we have research economists on, and also people very interested in policy on. I think I'm sure, not speaking for you, Caroline, but I feel confident you'd welcome feedback anywhere in the policy to research spectrum. I see Jeremy raising a hand.
Yeah, I have a quick question. Not to cut out people from the policy world, if anyone else wants.
Not at all. Go ahead.
So I thought that the talk was really interesting. I was wondering if you've tried to look, this is related to David's comment on the correlated shocks across municipalities, potentially, but if you've tried to, actually look for spillovers across municipality borders. So, if we think changing preferences or knowledge diffusion is a mechanism, you might expect to see, if you live next to a municipality that has changing preferences driven by migration destinations, that might impact you directly, independent of your own migration destination. So it could be something interesting to look at.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. We have not looked at that, but we can definitely add that to our list as well. Thank you.
Caroline, in your Makati example, I think this is just an example of one of the concerns that David raised. That the interaction term is raised if the same number of people from Makati go to Japan and Japan changes policy, or Japan doesn't change policy and more people from Makati start going to Japan. No, those are indistinguishable in the variation of the interaction term. And what I wonder is how we can distinguish between people who in Makati who for other reasons are beginning to modify their fertility behavior, hearing about this policy change in Japan and being therefore more willing to go, coming to see it more as a place that's going to respect their rights more generally as women. If I'm interpreting David's comments right, this is just a subset of something that he said, but I want to make sure that I'm not making a mistake. Can that scenario be distinguished from the causal effect of interest, which is the policy change on behavior?
So you're saying the difference between if more migrants went to Japan compared to, and that driving the change?
Some other event in Makati relative to other districts causes fertility to go down more there over time, and the same things that are driving that that more and more women in Makati are asserting their rights to greater degree and pursuing their desired fertility to greater degree, increases their willingness to go to Japan post policy change, because this is something that people hear about and talk about and come to understand is a good reason they should want to go to Japan.
So Michael, just to be clear,
go ahead.
No, just to be clear, the interaction is using base shares interacted with policy changes. So it's not actually using the current migration rates in the interaction. Now, it is another channel through which the effect could take place if you suddenly have a lot more people migrating to those destinations with the policy change. That could be a different channel from the norm change channel, but it's not changing the interaction per se, because it's all the base. It's only T=0 shares getting interacted with current policy changes in that interaction.
Thank you. No, that's a mistake I was making. I thought it was just share with fixed effects, and in fact, it's much more sophisticated than that.
But so that's kind of your fourth channel, though, I think, David, right? Like thinking about that response, and that we'll have to think about how we can account for that, because I think you're both right that that's something we should think about.
Mead over commenting, and thank you very much, Mead. Would there be many degrees of freedom left by pursuing David's recommendations? Is a great question.
Yeah, I don't have a great sense here. I can tell you that we did the same sort of thing in another paper that I have with Gaurav Khanna and Dean Yang, where we're looking at exchange rate shocks. And we did have variation that was left after we did the corrections that you would want to see for the Bartik kind of style assignment of shocks. But the exchange rate shocks were different, so I'm not sure here necessarily.
Other thoughts, or shockingly, we could finish on time in spite of myself. No, if there aren't, I'd invite anybody who wants to stay on the call, because there's no reason it has to end. And I'd love to chat with a couple of you, but then let me just call the formal seminar to a close. And thank you very much.